This week, we are going to conclude our examination of the different market structures that businesses will engage in when they compete against each other, or in the case of a monopoly, those industries in which there really is no competition. So as we conclude our examination of these market structures, this week we'll be examining two market structures, that of a monopolistic competition and that of an oligopoly. So I do want you to understand that in the market structures, monopoly is different from monopolistic competition. Sometimes students will answer questions relating to monopolistic competition as though it were a monopoly, or they will answer a question about monopolistic competition as though it were perfect competition. It's important for you to understand that monopolistic competition is an entity unto its own, and it has its own criteria for this market structure, as does an oligopoly. So each of these four market structures are unique. They each have individual characteristics. So as you read questions, please make sure that you understand whether you're answering a question about a monopoly or answering a question about monopolistic competition. So monopolistic competition, if you'll recall from the previous slide, is a little bit closer to the perfect competition side of the spectrum. So that what that means is you have a lot of firms. And typically these firms are small entities. And the key is that they are all producing items that are similar. They're not identical like perfect competition. They are similar. Now, because this market structure is closer to perfect competition, what do you think might be the case when discussing barriers to entry? If you'll remember, perfect competition had no barriers to entry, and monopoly had absolute barriers to entry. So what do you think about monopolistic competition? Really, in monopolistic competition, there's easy entry and exit. A firm can come and go very easily. What makes this a unique market structure is that firms in monopolistic competition behave as though they are price makers. That's like a monopoly, as opposed to price takers. That's like perfect competition. So you have a whole lot of firms selling similar products. They're not exactly identical. And each firm behaves as though they are the only ones that produces that particular product. So in their minds, they're thinking they're behaving like a monopoly. So for example, I asked my daughter over the weekend what it is that she liked about Arby's. She went to Arby's the previous week, and she said she really liked the curly fries. And she struggled to name other fast food restaurants that had curly fries like Arby's did. You might think about a coffee shop. You know, where does one purchase Starbucks coffee? It comes from Starbucks. You can't go to Dunkin' Donuts and order a Starbucks coffee. You get Dunkin' Donuts coffee at Dunkin' Donuts. So each firm believes they're the only ones that are producing that particular product. But there's a lot of competition out there for similar products. So where do firms in in monopolistic competition, where do they maximize their profits? Exactly like perfect competition and monopoly, they're going to maximize profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So a monopolistic competition, they're going to behave like a monopoly, but they're going to maximize their profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And so the examples of these really are exactly like what we did when discussing monopoly. So here we have the Green Bean, which is a coffee shop in a mall selling cups of organic coffee. Don't know if anybody caught the pun in that. Their demand curve and costs of production are given below. And as a firm in monopolistic competition, they're going to decide on the price and quantity, which is going to maximize their profits. So the way you're going to analyze this is exactly what you did in the previous chapter when looking at a single price monopolist. So I encourage you to pause the video and see if you can work this one out. So if they price their coffee at $5.75, they'll sell 100 cups per week with a revenue of $575, which is a marginal revenue of $575. If they price the price at $5.50, they'll sell 200 cups of coffee, which means they'll have $1,100 of revenue. That's just price times quantity. And that means that their marginal revenue is $574. So they went from $575 to $1,100, which is a difference of $574. Okay. You'll notice the total cost, I'm going to rise from $525 to $750, which is a difference of $225. Per unit, it's $2.25 because your change in quantity is 100. As I go from 200 cups of coffee to 300 cups of coffee, my cost goes from $750 to $960. So that's a difference of $210, or per cup of coffee, $2.10. So they're going to maximize their profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That means they're going to sell 500 cups of coffee. At what price? They're going to sell 500 cups of coffee, not at $3.75. The price is $4.75. They make the price, and the demand curve says that at $4.75, they would have a demand of 500 cups of coffee. So they ultimately end up making a profit of $790. So that's just $23.75 minus $15.85 gives you a profit of $790. So the question is, in a case like this, in this market structure, you have a firm that is now making profit. What's going to happen in this market? You have a coffee shop that's making economic profit in monopolistic competition. Remember, there's easy entry and exit. So if there's one coffee shop that's making profit, chances are there might be some other ones that want to get into this market structure. And pretty soon you see coffee shops popping up all over. So what do you suppose happens to the profit in monopolistic competition? It tends to disappear in the long run. So here's another example, just to make sure that you can do this. Sally and Fran opened a pizza parlor. They have a special sauce that makes their pizza unique. But pizza is a pretty good case of monopolistic competition. Where do you get Domino's pizza? From Domino's. Their recipe is a little bit different than Little Caesars pizza. But they're both round. They both have tomato sauce. They both have cheese. One may be better than the other, but they're pretty similar products. So where is this firm going to maximize its profit? Again, you should be able to do this because you've had several examples. They behave as though they were a monopoly. So again, the revenue is price times quantity. And your marginal revenue is just the difference in revenue as you go from one quantity to the next. And your marginal cost as you go from one quantity to the next. Your average cost, I threw this on there just to remind you that average cost, remember, is total cost divided by quantity. So you'll see that it goes down and then it goes back up again. So in this case, where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost? So marginal revenue equals marginal cost at 4 pizzas. What's the price going to be? $12. So in this case, I have a firm that they're making some profit, $28. Again, what's going to happen in this market? It's monopolistic competition. You have a firm that's making economic profit. So more firms are going to enter into this market. So now here's something that's kind of unique about monopolistic competition. These firms all want to hang on to their profits, but there is no barrier to entry like a monopolist. So they all want to hang on to their profits, and they all want to convince the customer that theirs is the best. So what do they end up doing? They typically do a lot of advertising. If you look at the advertising of products out there, much of that advertising really is for firms in monopolistic competition. You typically don't have a lot of competition or a lot of advertising for firms in perfect competition because they're all selling the same thing. And you may have some advertising with monopolists, but remember, they're the only ones that are selling that product. So they may not actually need to advertise their product. And if they do, it may really just be for informational purposes, such as we now have this new drug that will cure whatever the disease is. But a lot of the intense advertising is done by firms in monopolistic competition. And the reasoning behind this is they're trying to hold on to their customers. But what ends up happening is this just raises their costs of production. So they're trying desperately to keep customers from switching, from going to another pizza place or going to another coffee shop. But the problem is the customer may feel as though the items, maybe they're similar. And this may lead to what's called excess capacity. So excess capacity is the difference between where the firm operates to maximize its profit and where the firm would actually minimize its average total cost. So in this case, you have a situation where they're not actually going to end up minimizing their average total costs because their cost structures are rising, but they're also possibly losing customers. And the best way that I can illustrate this is I usually ask my students, how many of you go to donut shops? And there's usually a handful that will say, well, we'll go to Dunkin' Donuts or we'll go to Red's Donuts. You know, everybody likes Red's. Every now and then I get somebody who says that they'll go to Munnell's Donuts. There's a few other donut shops out there. Parcells sells donuts down in Draftonville. Frankly, there's people that go to Walmart to get a donut. But usually I'll have a handful of students who, they don't really care for donuts. So they don't ever really go to donut shops to get a donut. So what happens when there's a new donut shop that comes to town? Well, let's say that Red's was the only donut shop in Paducah for the longest time, and there were 100 people that went there, and those are the people who like donuts. And then all of a sudden, Dunkin' Donuts opens up a shop. Well, Red's might lose some of its customers to Dunkin' Donuts. Dunkin' Donuts isn't really going to attract all those people that don't even like donuts. they're going to pull customers away from the other donut shops. So as competition increases in monopolistic competition, the demand curve for each individual store starts to decrease because they're losing customers. And when that happens, they end up shifting the demand curve to the left to a point at which where they're operating isn't really going to minimize their average total costs. So in this case, in this graph, you see they would produce 4 units at a price of $20. But the minimum of their average costs is much greater. And I always like to point out to students, restaurants. Have you ever been to a restaurant and it was kind of empty? I mean, there's some off days for restaurants. Some restaurants, they'll have peak days, maybe on the weekend, but maybe Tuesday night, it's an off day and there's really not a lot of people there. Well, that's excess capacity. They built the restaurant to seat a whole lot more people because that's what they really would like to be doing. But in reality, for much of the time, they actually are not serving a full restaurant. The same thing with Dunkin' Donuts and all the donut shops. I always am amazed when I go to Dunkin' Donuts and I look at all the donuts that they have produced. And they keep producing a lot of donuts, hoping to sell them all. But the reality is there's other places you could get a donut. Now, some donut shops are really good about just donating the extras at the end of the day. Some donut shops, I guess, are really bad and they'll just sell the stale donuts the next day. I remember living in Blacksburg and the donut shop actually at 3 o'clock just got rid of all of its day's donuts. And it just opened the case and said, you can have 2 donuts to take home. And college students lined up, took the donuts home, and then they closed the store. So they recognized they weren't going to really get any more business because there were other places to get donuts in town. So excess capacity is one of these challenges with monopolistic competition. And it tends to make monopolistic competition an inefficient market structure. You have a whole lot of firms selling similar things. Their costs tend to be higher, so they tend not to be making as much profit really as they possibly could be making because they've got to keep their customers coming. And so typically what they'll end up doing is they'll create a new product and be the only one that does that. So I read an article that indicated that Coca-Cola now actually has over 5 different items. One of those items that they're actually taking off the list is Tab. Now, I know some of you probably have never even heard of Tab. It's a diet drink. It's a diet cola. It's not like Diet Coke. It came out before Diet Coke, I believe. It was made with saccharin, kind of had an acidic taste to it, and they're now taking it off. So that means Coca-Cola now has 499 different items. That's a lot of items for one beverage manufacturer to produce. So you end up with sort of an inefficient market, but you do get lots of choices, and maybe you get some really cool donuts. So the last market structure is the market structure called an oligopoly. There's a few of these out there, but most of American industry is really in monopolistic competition. But you'll notice an oligopoly is closer to the monopoly side. So it's closer to the side where there's less competition. So think about an entity, an industry that has few sellers. Not one, that would be a monopoly with a barrier to entry. But an oligopoly has few sellers. It really doesn't matter about the product, whether they're the same or the similar, but the key is there's few sellers and there's very high barriers to entry. So what ends up happening is these firms will behave strategically, mostly because they know who the competition is, because there's only a handful of them out there. So I typically like to think about the barriers to entry with an oligopoly. An example of an oligopoly would be the car manufacturing business, not the car retail industry, the manufacturing. So can you name who the car manufacturers of the world are? You can probably name most of them off the top of your head. Ford, Toyota, Nissan, Tesla has entered into the market. Well, think about this, the barrier to entry. What's to prevent one of you students from coming into the car manufacturing market? Probably is an expensive market to get into, and I very rarely run into students that happen to have an extra couple $1 billion laying around that they could start a car company with. Now, the retail industry is different. There's lots of retail shops out there selling cars. This is the manufacturing side of the industry. And there's really just a handful of these car manufacturers. Now, these car manufacturers tend to behave strategically. They tend to watch what the other entities are doing. I remember years ago in the minivan market, one of the companies, I believe it was Dodge, figured out how to create a minivan in which the back seat folded down and left you with some cargo room. All the other minivans at that time, you had to actually take the seat out if you wanted cargo room. Well, this company figured out how to redesign and re-engineer the vehicle so that the third seat could actually fold down into a well. So what do you suppose happened a couple years later? Yeah, pretty much all the other minivan producers started to do the same thing, and they produced minivans in which the car seats go down into this well and you end up with cargo room. So in the case of an oligopoly, because you have few firms, they tend to look at what the other is doing. But what they end up doing kind of depends on what the other firm is going to be doing also. So typically they really would desire to maximize profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But the reality is sometimes they don't end up doing that. They end up thinking strategically instead. So there's different ways to model this. The textbook presents what's called the kinked demand curve as one way to model an oligopolist. It's kind of gone out of fashion because we've not really come up with, in recent years, some good examples of the kinked demand curve. Theoretically, it makes sense. And essentially what this means is I have a demand curve for my product, which is elastic above a certain price and inelastic below a certain price. And the reasoning behind this is, if I were the company and I were to raise my price, my competitors probably would choose not to raise their prices, and I would lose my customers. So again, think of the car manufacturing business. If Ford Motor Company decided, well, we're going to produce a small pickup truck and we're going to price it at $150,000, just a plain old little pickup truck. I guarantee you Ford's not going to sell many of those little old pickup trucks at $150,000 because I'm going to go to Nissan or Toyota or some other company and purchase their little pickup truck instead. So above a certain price, if Ford raises it, they're just going to lose their customers. Now, if Ford decides to lower the price, let's say they have this little pickup truck and they say, we're going to sell it for $20,000. I guarantee you all the other ones are going to lower their prices too, because they don't want to lose business to Ford. Well, what ends up happening is nobody really gains any new customers that way. You just sort of end up losing profits. So in the kinked demand curve, above a certain price, the firm may decide that they really would like to raise the price, but they're going to lose the quantity. And it tends to be rather elastic. Below the price, the demand curve is more inelastic because they're really not gaining all that many customers. So what ends up happening is the price tends to be sticky around some point, which is where the kink is. The challenge is determining where that point actually is. And this is where businesses have really started to get a little bit more creative in their marketing and in their industries. And the stickiness of those prices tends not to be as evident now as it once was. So again, above that sticky price, your competitors tend to ignore that increase. You can raise your price all you want, but you're going to lose business. So your demand would go way down. Your quantity demanded would go way down. Below that sticky price, your quantity demanded really doesn't go up very much because the competitors also lowered their prices. So there's a couple of other ways that we can possibly model an oligopoly. One is what's called price leadership, essentially where there's a dominant firm, they set the price, and the other firms in the industry, they just sort of follow along. They kind of do what that dominant firm tends to do. So for example, in the steel industry, in the United States at one time, there were some dominant steel manufacturers, and they pretty much set the price of steel, and the other firms, they produced steel, but they pretty much had to kind of follow along with what the dominant firms were doing. Now, one challenge with this is in some countries, it is possible for the firms just to simply get together and to collude. What that means is they agree to set the price. And this is what's called a cartel, in which firms agree to set the price, typically pretty high, and they all agree to keep the price pretty high. The challenge with that is there's an incentive to cheat against the cartel. So in the United States, cartels are illegal, but there was a case decades ago in the airline industry. It used to be in the airline industry, you really only had a couple of choices. There was Eastern Airlines, there was Delta Airlines, there was Continental and TWA. We didn't have the plethora of regional airlines like we have now, JetBlue and Allegiant and all kinds of other airlines now. So back in the day, they discovered that the airlines were actually using their ticketing system to signal to the other firms what the price of the ticket should be. And I don't remember which one they found as the initiator of the price, but essentially what happened was that one of the dominant airlines would set the price, and they would signal to the other airlines, here's the price for this flight. And the other airlines would pretty much follow suit. And they all agreed that we're just going to do what the dominant carrier does for that particular flight. So another way that firms can compete against each other really is by something other than the price mechanism. So for example, they might come up with an innovation that nobody else has done. So interestingly, in the minivan market, to make it so that the third row seat could fold down into the wheel well, they actually had to redesign the axes and the actual frame of the vehicle. And the other car manufacturers had yet to figure out how to do that. So the one company, I think it was Dodge, figured out how to do that. They kept it secret as long as they could while they redesigned it. And then when they came out with it, they advertised, we're the only one that has a third row seat that folds into the wheel well. And then pretty much everybody else did the same thing later on. So a final way that we can model an oligopolist behavior is the idea of game theory. And if you ever have a chance to take a course in game theory, if you're really interested in economics, it's a fascinating way to think about people's strategic behaviors. But typically with an oligopoly, if we think about the way they behave, one possible way is that they simply do what the competitor did last time. And this is often where we end up with price wars. So for example, while this isn't an oligopoly industry, every now and then you might have two gas companies located on the interstate, and there's no other gas companies around. And it's just those two right at that one exit. And when one firm lowers its price, 5 cents, then the next firm says, well, we got to lower our price 5 cents. And so they'll do that. And then the next week, the other firm lowers its price again 5 more cents. And then firm B lowers its price 5 more cents. And pretty soon the price of gas gets really cheap at that exit. They typically run out of gas because then there ends up being a shortage because the market price of gas is much higher than that. So what we end up with is sort of this tit for tat strategy. I'm going to do what you did last time. There's some challenges with modeling that because typically with raising the price, who's going to do that? So again, with the gas companies, if firm A ends up lowering its price to 10 cents and firm B ends up lowering its price to 10 cents, well, which company is going to be the first to raise the price? It's against the law for them to go have a conversation and collude with each other. So they're now both at 10 cents. They're losing money. Well, if firm A raises it to 15 cents, firm B may just decide to keep it down at 10 cents just for a little bit longer to get some more customers. So the way they behave strategically, it's really hard to model in any single graph like we could with perfect competition, monopoly, and monopolistic competition. So in summary, we've looked at 4 different market structures. Make sure that you understand all 4 of these market structures, the characteristics of each of these industries, how they behave, where they maximize profits. They all would like to maximize profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but the oligopolist has a hard time doing that because of the strategic nature of its industry. So in this chapter, you've looked at the last 2, monopolistic competition and oligopolies. In the next chapter, we'll examine one more kind of market structure, the labor market. And this is going to be rather unique because in the labor market, we are the suppliers and the businesses are the demanders. So this concludes the 4 main market structures for goods and services.